Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining in to our webinar today. I have with me Ashim Bacha, Managing Director for UK and South Africa. Uh, this is Mark Rodrigues. I'm going to be your host for today. We're so glad you've joined us for this webinar today. Let us know where you're joining us from the comments. I'm actually in India. Ashim, you're in London. Where are you?
I'm in London. That's right, London. Coming to you live.
Nice. While we get started, we're waiting for our co-host for today, Caroline, to join on. But it's so great to have you on with us. I hope you're looking forward to today's session. I know a bunch of you already sent your questions ahead of time. We're looking forward to get that answered. But if you have any questions, you can start putting them in the comment section. We're doing a Q&A at the end, so we'll definitely get to them at the end. Nice. So we've got people from, oh, it looks like we've got people from Oklahoma, from Egypt. Wow, nice. San Francisco to uh, Bangalore in India. Wow, that's a great audience. We're so excited. All of y'all are here. We'll probably give it about 10 seconds before I can have Ashim take it away, and we'll bring Caroline in too.
Perfect.
How's
Yeah,
the
it's great
weather
to
there
have
in the
everybody
UK,
here.
Ashim?
Oh, it's a bit of a mixed, rainy summer day, but that's normal for us here in the UK. I know Caroline is from Seattle, so they at least have a much better summer than we do. But we're all used to the rain. So if you're used to the rain where you live, let us know in the comments. It's good to see people from all over the world.
Absolutely. Hi, Caroline. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. How are y'all?
We're wonderful. We were just trying to figure out where people are joining in from today, and it seems like we've got people from all over the globe joining us. It's
Oh,
exciting.
fantastic. That's awesome.
I know a lot of the listeners for today, you're looking for the free Insights Repository guide. I hope you've registered for the webinar if you're joining us live, but you haven't registered. I'm just going to put the link in the comment section right now. Make sure you go in and register on there so you get a copy of the deck and the free Insights Repository that Nick actually worked on after today's call. We'll be sending that to you in the next couple of days or so. With that, I don't want to take too much time away from you guys, so I'm going to pull myself out. Ashim, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mark, and thank you everybody for joining. It's fantastic to see everybody from all over the world. Yeah, we got some more rainy cities. We've got Vancouver over there. We've got Winnipeg. So great to see everybody. Keep on putting your location in the comments. We'd love to see that. As Mark mentioned, today we're going to be really talking about Insights Repositories, and I'm so pleased to have Carolyn here today, who's actually built an Insights repository and is going to tell us all about it. But one thing that would be good to know from the audience, if you can put it in the comments, let us know how your Insights teams work today. One thing that would be interesting to know is how many studies are you doing a year? The more organized you've got to be, and that's really what we're going to be talking about here today. So with the scene kind of set, again, talking about insights, repositories, and managing all of the insights that we're generating, let me move ahead to introductions and introduce my very special guest, Carolyn from Okta, Research Ops Associate. And really, we're going to get some really nice insight about how she's building out her insights team and organizing things. So I'll let Carolyn introduce herself in a second. Just to introduce myself, I'm the managing director for QuestionPro here in the UK, in Ireland, South Africa. I also take care of Canada. It's nice to see some Canadians on the line. As you know, I am not Nick. Nick had a bit of a last-minute emergency that he's dealing with, so I'm hopping in here. So you won't see Nick on the call. He's our director of Insights Hub. But in some ways, he's the guy in the weeds, right? Like, he knows all about Insights Hubs. And so I think this is almost going to be better for us to have a little bit more of a basic conversation about how insights people, market researchers, anybody who's kind of in the insights industry can actually make more sense around this new concept of what is even an Insights Hub. But before we go further, Carolyn, let me give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for letting me introduce myself. Good morning, everybody. My name's Carolyn Shetter. As I was introduced, I am a research ops associate at Okta in the Auth0 product unit. We were acquired about, my goodness, 10 months ago by Okta. My path to research ops and UX in general has been very windy, like a lot of people who end up in the field. I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry. I'm a PhD dropout. I've worked a lot in education and nonprofit management spaces, and UX research kind of came under my radar as a way to combine the things I really like. So solving problems with data, but also getting to connect with people and talk with people about how they prefer to solve their problems and understand how they think about things. I started off actually as an intern at Auth0 and then was brought on full time. I had the option to either join as a researcher or join the ops team. I opted to go into ops because I like the fact that I get to build relationships in operations and that I'm working consistently with the same people. Whereas for any researchers in the room, you get a lot of churn and talk to people one time, but don't necessarily get the chance to build those relationships out, which was very important for me. My focus as a research ops associate at Auth0 has particularly been in knowledge management. So like everybody said, I manage our Insights repository. We currently use a Jira system, which I'm sure I'll dive a little bit more into, so I won't share too many details there, but also manage a lot of the tools we use, one of them being Great Question. And also right now, another big initiative I'm doing is trying to build out our panel for recruiting for participants who may not particularly be represented, such as people with accessibility needs, disabilities, or neurodivergence. But yeah, that's my short spiel. Excited to get going.
Amazing, amazing. And Carolyn, just tell us a little bit about Okta and Auth0. Tell us a little bit about the company, what you guys do. I'm obviously very familiar. Like I mentioned, I'm from Seattle, so nice hometown companies there. But maybe just for the audience, just to give them a little bit of insight into the company and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, sure. So Okta and Auth0 are both in the identity management space. So Okta's a little bit more on the workforce side. So I'm trying to think of one of our biggest customers on that end. If you're logging into Thomson Reuters ever, you're probably getting some sort of identification through Okta. It's a lot similar on the Auth0 side, except we work more on the identity management piece for self-serve users. So basically on our end, just making lives easier for developers as they try to build authentication. People tend to realize how complex it is and how much time it takes and how precarious it can be and how difficult it can be. And Auth0 is just basically a solution for folks who are building these platforms to not have to focus so hard on the identity piece and be able to focus on the other areas of your product or service without having to be so stressed about identity, because it is a really stressful thing. So yeah, our teams work a lot with developers, but we're also starting to connect more with folks who may not typically fit into our developer archetype, product managers, IT folks, what have you. So, but yeah, that's a little bit about what Auth0/Okta does.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's always one of those where I think probably everybody on this this webinar has used it before without knowing it, right? It's like AWS, it's like you logged into some site that's using the technology, but the job is to be behind the scenes. And Carolyn, just before we move on to the agenda, research ops, that's it's such a great title. I feel like a lot of research teams don't actually have a dedicated ops person. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about like, what is that role? How big is the team? What does the team look like over there?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thank you for asking. I think research ops is very new. As far as I'm aware, the term has only been around since about 2018, right? Research in itself is kind of still pretty new. So operations for research, also pretty new as well. My boss, Brad Arrigo, came to Auth0 originally with the idea of building an ops first research team. So basically, with that kind of idea in mind, it's the ability to scale research and being able to say, okay, here are set protocols, procedures, here's our playbook, now go out and do it. Auth0 runs under a self-serve model, as well as we have our own researchers too, but they're not necessarily set to a dedicated team. So we have all kinds of folks doing research at Auth0, between product marketers, product designers, product managers, the marketing team as well. So it's a really great way to get a lot of people experienced in research, and also just kind of driving that, anyone who's a researcher in here or has had to push research in any way, it's a lot of evangelism and trying to get people to believe in the power of research and what it means to be able to approach building a feature with actual actual data, as opposed to just, well, we think this is what our customer base wants, or one customer has requested this, so we're just going to do it. So it's been really cool to experience that. I know that's definitely not the case at a lot of companies. But yeah, for our team, we're a mighty team of 2. Our research team at Auth0 is not super large. So we've got 1 researcher currently, and then 2 folks on ops, including myself. But yeah, it's a relatively new field, but I think the way Brad has set up the team has been really smart, and it's been really cool to see, our researcher get to focus on those really discovery-based, high-end questions that are really going to push the product forward, and allowing, everybody for their team doing their own research to be able to focus on some of those lower level usability tests, even some discovery interviews based off of a product team. Folks are able to do themselves, which, 1, saves time for researchers really being able to go out and do the things that matter. And then 2, kind of spreads the idea of like, oh, we're actually talking to customers and able to relate to them and understand their pain points and what it is they're looking for from our product. So I think overall it's been working really well.
That's super helpful. And I think it's just enlightening for people to understand how that structure works. I think for so many insights teams, it's a small insights team, just like you, but the whole notion is that everybody is a researcher, right? Every product manager, every brand manager. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, is how do you actually enable everybody to be a researcher, centralize those insights, add a process to that. And so that's a really good segue to kind of our agenda for today. What we're going to talk about is exactly this kind of problem, right? How do you take a really large company where you've got a small amount of researchers and actually centralize a process to provide all those insights in one place? We'll talk about what that problem really looks like, the problem that Carolyn faced, the problem that we see with a lot of our clients in the insight space. We'll talk about what are the building blocks of a repository to kind of solve this problem. We'll talk about the different types of insights repositories and maybe what you might want to think about as you kind of move through that adoption phase with what might be called an insights repository. And then we'll talk about implementation and save some time for questions. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump in. As Mark mentioned, do leave your questions on the comments, and we'll get to those at the end. So let's start with the problem here, really about, what is the struggle? Carolyn, we talked about this a little bit, this notion that, hey, there's only a few insights people here, but maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what was the problem that you kind of felt like, we really need an insights repository to help with this. Walk us through kind of what that looked like for you at Okta.
Yeah, sure. So, when my boss originally started at Auth0, there wasn't a repository. They were very early in their research journey. So like a lot of you folks may be on the call, just getting started, trying to figure out where to go from the beginning, basically. And originally it was just a table in Confluence of basically, here's the research we did, the folks who did it, maybe a link to the actual research summary that happened, the feature team, etc. But it wasn't a ton of information. And basically, as we started ramping up and doing more and more research, it was pretty clear that Confluence was not going to be a great solution in the long term. It's pretty annoying. I don't know how many folks in here have used Confluence, but it's just like any other Wikidoc, where really you can create a table, but you can only have so many columns in the table before you have to start scrolling across And it can be really agitating and annoying, and it's not very good for taxonomy. So if you're looking for specific keywords around a study that you're doing, so a lot of the things we track now, we weren't necessarily able to track then because it was just kind of a low level, like basic of here's what we've learned, not so much a more in-depth repository, which we have now. And now that we have a little bit more of an advanced solution, it's a lot easier for folks to kind of skim through and be able to find what it is they're looking for based off of the insights that we have, and not just kind of have to go off of the couple bullet points that we maybe had in a Confluence table. But yeah, it's super inefficient. It was hard to find sometimes. We were also relying on people doing their due diligence to actually input stuff into the table at first, which is, anyone who's had to manage any type of insights repo before, any type of team or person, it's just a thing that gets lost in the wayside. So without having necessarily a person to dedicate to that, it can be really frustrating, and it may not always be up to date. So there's just a lot of things whenever you're kind of in that first evolution that can really make the process include a lot of friction.
Yeah, it's essentially like a big shared spreadsheet, right? Like it looks good for the first few rows, and then it gets really, really out of hand. But just to back up a little bit, the reason why you need a shared spreadsheet in the first place, and I think so many insights teams face this, is that you're basically doing study after study, right? You're almost like an internal agency. You've got a bunch of business stakeholders that are asking you for things. You run a study, you come up with some results, and you send it off to them. A year later, somebody else comes with the same question. Instead of going and looking for the data that you already have, right? Hey, what do we know about this audience? What do we know about this product? What do we know about this feature? So that's even the starting point. And I think a lot of people are facing that even without a shared spreadsheet, like, whoa, this data is siloed, it's forgotten, it's underutilized. And then, of course, there's no workflow to it, right? If somebody's sending you a Slack message or an email saying, hey, can we get this study done in the next week? They're like, what are the assets? Why do we need it? Who's the target audience? So these are some of the things that we'll kind of talk through as we go through this presentation. And I think what Carolyn is talking about is that first evolution, which is, okay, let's start with maybe a shared spreadsheet, but pretty quickly that breaks down and we need something even more advanced than that. But let us know in the comments section if you're facing that as well, this kind of notion that, oh, well, we keep on doing the same studies, but nobody's looking at the stuff that we already have. And we've all been in Insights forever. You probably have a database at this point of hundreds of studies. As soon as you get past like 5 or 10, that shared spreadsheet just starts to break down. So that's kind of, I think, where we're coming from, right? I think what Carolyn is doing and what we're thinking about in QuestionPro is, how do we actually create a platform that consolidates everything in one place really easily? It allows you, but more importantly, the rest of your people to explore the database of insights that you already have. All of these studies can be searchable, discoverable, and give your entire company an asset instead of something that you just do a study every time that they come to you and ask for something. So, how do we think about this? I think, and it'll also be good to get Carolyn's thoughts on this, but I think everybody is using some tools today when it comes to research, right? You've got your quant application for surveys. You've maybe got some qual tools for user interviews. And then typically what comes out at the end of the day is like a PDF or a PowerPoint or an Excel report, and that kind of gets sent off to people. We're basically looking at this and saying, well, what's that kind of fourth leg, right? To really kind of store all of these pieces of information. Carolyn, is this how you think about it as well? Or is this kind of what the tool set looks like over there at Okta as well?
Yeah, for the most part, this is what we're looking at. To be honest, we don't do a ton of quantitative research at this time, aside from surveys. But yeah, this is a pretty similar setup to what we have as well. Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the components of an Insights repository. So we've talked about the problem, hey, we're doing all this research, nobody can find it, it's not easy to organize or get access to. We talked a little bit about what a solution can look like. Now let's talk about the components of what we would actually think about as kind of being the layers of an Insights repository. And this maybe is some of the reasons where that kind of spreadsheet or Confluence notion breaks down, right? Is, does it really have all of these layers to be truly discoverable? The three that we think about, and I'd love to kind of get Carolyn's input on this, is first is discoverable insights. So a row in a spreadsheet is discoverable maybe by searching for kind of the text of that row, or just sorting it or filtering it. But a lot of times the data isn't that structured. And so when we think about discoverability, we think about this notion of tags, indexing at a very deep level. So you're not just indexing the title of that report, but you're actually indexing all the way down into the nuggets, the insights, the raw data, maybe even some of the open-ended feedback that's coming into those. And then searchable, right? Really make it searchable so that people can discover those things. Tags are really good, right? Because you can tag in a variety of different ways. It could be the feature that the insight or the research is about. It could be the audience. It could be the segment, the market segment. So all of these things we kind of put into discoverable insights. And then we take that a next step down and we talk about what were the observations that the researcher actually came up with. So, you know, not raw data, right? Like what are the 3 or 4 big takeaways that you actually took from that? I think you want to make sure that you're not just showing a bunch of raw data to everybody and you know, assuming that they're going to make sense of it. Put some tags on there, put some nuggets, some takeaways, and then finally you also would give access to the raw research data. Are those the components that you think about in your Insights repository, Carolyn? Tell us a little bit more about how it works for you.
Yeah, sure. This is actually pretty much how we set it up. So right now we use, like I mentioned, Jira as our Insights repository. So we kind of start off with a high level overview of what the study actually is. With titles, we do have a lot of different pieces of our taxonomy for indexing. So it's a lot easier to search and filter through. And pretty much the exact same situation. Under the description of the research study, you'll have your specific nuggetized research, which is just the kind of big key takeaways. Mm-hmm. And then if you're interested in going deeper, we always link the research summary. So you can go find mm-hmm. those assets that you're looking for. So if you want to go watch interviews, if you want to go look at interview notes, if you want to rewatch an unmoderated usability test, those are all available to you. But yeah, this is pretty much how we organize our repository as well.
Makes sense. So the way I like to think about it is almost like a pyramid, right? Like at the top, you've got your tags, your headlines, your keywords, your kind of, you know, searchable items. Everything should be searchable, but that would be kind of the main tags. Then you've got your nuggets, your takeaways. And finally, if you really want to dig in, here's the raw results, the raw data, you know, videos of user interviews, the raw data from Quant. It's all there that people can kind of dive into. Carolyn, tell us a little bit about, how do you actually organize that? Like, what does your taxonomy look like? Do you force a certain set of tags, a certain set of keywords? Are there certain parameters that everybody needs to put onto the study before it comes into the Insights repository?
Yeah, sure. So we don't necessarily really use a tagging system. The one thing with tagging that can get messy is just it's a little bit different, right, for us, because I'm typically the one managing and putting insights into the repository. The reason why we ended up choosing Jira is because it's a lot easier for folks to find what they're looking for, but a lot harder for people to put it in, so that, again, we can keep kind of a unified framework. And one of the reasons why is when you start adding tags into things, the way people tag can be very different. So for one person, they may put moderated usability study, another person might just put usability study, another person might name it something else. So that's kind of the reasoning there. But in terms of the things we do keep track of in our taxonomy, we're keeping track of who's doing the research, what product team are they on, what's the feature they're particularly researching under, what kind of research is it? Is it an in-depth interview? Is it a survey? Is it usability testing, what have you? And then we start to go a little bit deeper, right? So we always include dates of the research, very important, but we also have the ability to keep track of emotions throughout the research. Like if there's a particularly frustrating piece, adding that frustration and how intense that frustration was, or how often people are running into a particular issue is another thing we keep track of. So again, it just adds to that kind of what you were talking about, the discoverability piece. So if you're, say, Eugenio, who's the lead of the Auth0 product unit, and you want to go find out the most frustrating pieces of working with Auth0, you can basically go filter by emotion and be able to go find all those things, which is really convenient when you're particularly looking for areas to improve on the product. But yeah, that's a little bit of a peek inside our taxonomy.
No, that's perfect. And I think that really underlines a lot of the things that we've learned at QuestionPro when kind of creating the Insights Hub product is you need to have a defined taxonomy, right? So kind of the drawbacks that you're talking about with tags is it's too open-ended, right? People can just use whatever tags they want to. But then in some ways, you're kind of saying, we've predefined the tags or the components that we really care about. Who did the research? These little things like emotions, right? Like that's something that might be very unique to your team, but it's defined, right? Anytime I want to find an emotion, okay, here are all the studies that talk about that. And I think for everybody on the call, you should really think about what is that taxonomy. Do not leave it open-ended. Make sure it's defined, but also it should be defined for your organization. So it might be based on audiences, it might be based on different products, locations, teams, whatever that criteria is, define it up front. And then those can go into either the columns, the tags, the keywords, however that kind of comes to fruition in your Insights Hub kind of system, then that will make it discoverable for everybody. But exactly what Carolyn's saying, like you don't want to leave it open-ended because then nothing becomes searchable. Then everybody's using a unique word for each individual thing. So this is a really important kind of starting point before you go down this route of creating a repository. So we talked about this a little bit. I won't dive too much into it. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And Carolyn, you already talked about, like, we've got to put the attribution on there, right? Who did the research so that when people are discovering it, they know who to talk to if they've got questions. There's good attribution there. But let's go one step further and talk a little bit about this kind of notion of snapshots, right? Like, how do you disseminate this information? So we've talked a little bit about people coming to the repository and searching. Are you also doing any sort of push? Do you provide, weekly digests, notifications on Slack? Tell us a little bit about how are you providing snapshots more proactively to the stakeholders and the people that are using the research you develop?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we have a couple mechanisms for that. Recently, our research ops lead, Rodrigo Dalcin, has done a great job of automating our insights into Slack. So basically, anytime a new insight goes into our repository, everybody in our Auth0 user research channel, as well as in our Okta channel, is notified like, hey, here's a new study. Here's who completed the study, what product area, what feature. Here's a summary. Here are the insight nuggets from that study, and then the ability to go in and take further look at that research. That's been really wonderful just for engagement. We're also encouraging folks in the midst of their research, because again, another thing we do is keep track of research in a Jira board. So whenever somebody's in progress for executing research sessions, and they've been in progress for a couple days, they'll get a notification like, hey, share some updates from your research in our research channel. Which has been also really awesome to have. Another thing that we do on top of, just kind of the nudges is a lot of disseminating. So we have a monthly research readout where I lead the presentation in air quotes, but really the folks who are doing the research come and present on the research, can give a little bit more of an in-depth look than I may be able to. Just to encourage, again, more dialogue around the research, more folks reaching out. Another thing that we're trying to do, as inspired, I don't know if anybody was at the Research Ops Conference a few weeks ago that they hosted online or also in person in Brooklyn, New York. But there was a session, I can't remember the guy's name, but it was basically exactly on this topic of how to not let your insights go stale. So we're in the process of adding insights into our Jira product discovery board, basically where all of our feature teams keep track of potential ideas that they want to pursue in terms of improving their area. And basically being able to say, well, this particular idea is backed by this research, so this seems like a really good thing to pursue, or there's no research backing up this idea or this choice, so let's not continue on this route. But also even beyond that, just trying to kind of have a report ready for quarterly planning to be able to say like, hey, to our business agility team who runs our quarterly planning meetings, like, here's the research that's come out from the last 3 months, the last quarter, based off of the initiatives y'all have listed for quarterly planning. These are the ones that are actually backed by research that's been done recently. So we're trying, again, to more and more make sure the insights don't go stale. It's a forever problem, I'm sure, for everybody. But, you know, as we continue to keep it pushing, I'm sure we'll discover more ways that we can put the insights to use.
No, that's amazing. I mean, you guys are so far ahead, and it's good to know, right? Because everything that we've been talking about is kind of this notion of pull, right? It's somebody from the business coming to you, coming to your Insights repository to look up something, which is great. Most people don't have that in the first place, a searchable place for people in the organization to come to. But you also have to think about this push, right? Not everybody in the organization knows what the research teams are up to. And so it's great to see that you already have some of those things kind of figured out with Slack, you know, pushing those things out. I know it's what Nick is thinking about a lot with our Insights Hub product, this notion of weekly digest emails that go out, Slack notifications that go out. And I love, Carolyn, what you're talking about, where you're actually operationalizing this into the business process, right? That, hey, a feature can't be developed, or it's more likely for a feature to be developed if it's linked to a piece of research in the Insights Hub repository. And I think a lot of businesses are already somewhat operating like this, like, hey, we can't actually put media behind that ad until it's been tested. Hey, we're not going to build the ad until the storyboard has been tested or until the product concept has been tested. Insights Hubs, these repositories, give you a really good way to operationalize that. So it kind of becomes a gating function. Like, before you can pass that next gate, the link to the research, to the Insights Hub, has got to be put into that ticket, into that process before you can actually move forward. I love thinking about it that way. And I think that also just kind of helps promote what these insights teams are up to. A lot of times that work gets lost, but if you kind of push Notion and automating it, operationalizing it, I think everybody on the insights team is going to get a lot more value out of the work that they're doing within the organization itself. Cool. So we've talked about some of the concepts. We've talked about push and pull. Let's talk a little bit about the types of solutions when it comes to insights repositories. And I would almost think of this as like levels of adoption. So as everybody on the call is thinking about, okay, it might be time to actually create an insights repository, these are kind of the 3 levels that we think about. So the first level is really just using the apps that you're already using as the repository. So if you've got a piece of survey software like QuestionPro, okay, those surveys just become your research in, a repository. Or if you're using a qual system, that just becomes your repository. The problem is that most of these tools are not built to really be shareable, right? They're built for the people that are actually building the surveys, scripting the surveys, conducting the user interviews, and the licensing models are built that way. They're not really built to just kind of be provided to the entire organization to say, here's access, now go. But Carolyn, maybe let's take a pause there. Is this something that you thought about doing? Like, did you feel like, hey, you could just use the tools that you're using to collect the insights as the repository itself, or was that never really an option for you?
I mean, I think right now it is something we're considering. So we started using Great Question probably at the beginning of this fiscal year, January or so. We've been in conversation with them since last fall. We really needed a panel management tool more than anything else. Speaking of spreadsheets, our entire panel management process was done through a Google Sheet. So we really needed something a little bit more precise and more accurate for folks to be using, where we didn't rely once again on folks to use their Scout's honor to update things. They do have an insights repository tool that they have included. They're trying to become a full stack research tool, which is very exciting. But for us, kind of similar along the lines of what you said, Asim, it's just when it comes to bringing studies from outside of the tool, it's not very convenient.
Right.
It just creates a lot more work than would be necessary previously. But it is something, depending upon how the tool will be developed, that we may consider, because again, it would be nice to have everything in one place. And that's one of the reasons Great Question has worked out well for us, is because it's not only a panel management tool, they do interviews, unmoderated testing,
Right.
and they also have built-in automated incentives, emails. So everything that folks who are doing research that they need to do can be done through Great Question, which is super convenient. Anybody who's done research knows there's nothing more annoying than having to get your Calendly set up, hook it up to your Google Calendar, join the Zoom, get that recorded, go through the recording, use Zoom's transcript feature, have to send out the incentives yourself, send out the thank you emails and all the other emails yourself. It can be very frustrating. So within that way, it's worked out well, but it for a repository state at the moment, it's not something that we would use, because we're not just talking to folks who work with Auth0 or Okta. We want to talk to folks who don't necessarily have any experience with our product and learn certain things about them. And if we have to bring in studies that happen outside of Great Question, it's just administrative hassle, which is something we'd like to avoid.
That's the key, right? Is that, as soon as it works great when you're only doing studies in that application. And as soon as you're doing studies outside of it, it starts to break down. I know that's something that Nick has thought a lot about with our Insights Hub product. We've got a communities product that's great for panel management and doing, focus groups and user interviews. We've got our kind of core survey product that's great for quant. But at the end of the day, we also know that Insights Hub has to allow you to bring in studies and insights from other places. So, listen, there's still room in the world for an in-person focus group every now and then. Or maybe you're doing secondary research and you bought a great report and you're pulling out the insights and the nuggets from that. There should still be a place for that. And so I think that is the big gotcha when you're looking at just using the app for creating the research. Is it really flexible? Is it extendable? And so when we think about our Insights Hub product, of course, it's going to automatically integrate to our communities product and our research and our surveys product. But we also need to make sure that it's built to be open to all of the other places where you're gathering insights and research. So let's talk about kind of the next step that a lot of people face in their evolution. And I think, Carolyn, this is kind of where you are is that you're in this kind of custom built Insights repository. So you're taking a bunch of tools and APIs, connecting it all together, and it's kind of becoming highly flexible. But maybe there's some challenges in terms of, how complicated it is or how time intensive it is to build. Tell us a little bit about kind of where you are in your evolution. What are the upsides? What are the downsides to kind of taking on this custom built type of approach?
Yeah, for sure. I think Jira definitely has worked for us as much as it has been a pain a lot of the time. When I took over running the repository full time, it was a bit of a learning curve for figuring out exactly how everything worked. For those of you who have used Jira before, it's typically not used for an Insights repository. It's a lot more for tracking tasks and making sure we're following the roadmap and where we need to be. So it was a big mental model shift and understanding how exactly we set it up. Once I did get through that, it was a lot easier to understand, but it became very labor intensive, right? It's a lot of data entry and can be very frustrating. I would spend afternoons just going through Insights, especially, for some of these bigger studies that our researchers have been completing. There's a lot of different insights. So I would have to go in for each individual nugget and edit the particulars for each piece of the taxonomy, right? Which was time consuming, very frustrating. Again, big shout out to Rodrigo, my operations lead, because he's an automation genius. So we've been actually using Workato, which is pretty close to Zapier for automation within our repository. So the moment there is still some data entry, right? The moment I create a study in the repository, I still have to do the same things. Who completed the research, what feature, what team were they on, what dates were these conducted over, etc. But now that automates into every single nugget. So really all I have to do now is go into each nugget and update the sample date. So specifically, when was this nugget from? What interview? What unmoderated test or moderated test did it come from, basically? So it makes my life a ton easier now, but at first, without that automation, it would take forever to update that. And I think also within that, is much as I do love the filtration in our repository, I think because the mental model block is still there for a lot of people, and it is tricky to understand, like, okay, this research activity has a parent-child relationship to the nuggets. Like, people just don't necessarily get it. So kind of talking about letting insights go stale, I think because of that barrier, it's harder for people to be like, well, I'm going to go in and search for a particular research study, which again, back to our initiative to get stuff more in people's faces. But yeah, it definitely can be tricky in that way. So you have to be careful with the in-house solution sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's you guys are like on the bleeding edge, right? And I think, for so many teams, and maybe even on this call, I think a lot of these things are just over the head, right? Parent-child relationships and automating these things and plugging in with APIs. And so I think this becomes the big challenge when you're kind of doing the custom build, is you need somebody technical like yourself. You need an ops person to kind of go build in these things, understand a database and how parent-child relationships work, and how, if you're going to change a certain nugget, how does it make sure that it kind of, is connected to the right items. And that's really the thing that we're trying to solve at QuestionPro, is kind of for the, the insights teams where you don't have a technical person, an ops person, that can kind of do all of this automation. Here's more of an out-of-the-box solution that makes it really, really easy to get started, right? And you can change things via point and click in terms of, the tags that you're putting on there and the way that you're defining kind of the taxonomy and importing things and, switching the taxonomy or the parameters. So I won't go too much into this. I mean, this is a little bit of the pitch for QuestionPro and Insights Hub. It is a new product that we're kind of focusing on to solve this challenge. Do get the free guide that Mark mentioned at the top of this call. Come to us if you'd like a demo. But this is really, I think, the biggest thing that we're trying to solve for insights teams. And I think we realized from our customer set, they've got this problem with knowledge repositories. They're trying the spreadsheets things, but they maybe aren't advanced enough to really nail the custom solution. And that's where having an out-of-the-box Insights Hub solution might be really beneficial for folks. So if you're in that state, let us know. But for now, what I want to talk about is, how do you actually roll something like this out, right? If you think about it, implementation ends up maybe being one of the harder challenges to actually get people adopted. So let's walk through that. We've got some kind of tips and advice on the right way to do this. And I think one of the big things is you've got to have a champion. Somebody's got to own the taxonomy. Somebody's got to set the workflow. Somebody's got to be responsible for, training both the researchers, but then also making sure that the rest of the organization understands this. Is this a similar approach that you took, Carolyn? Would you say you're the champion? Walk us through kind of who rolled this out and what did that look like over there at Okta?
Yeah, sure. I would say it's probably pretty collaborative, right? My boss, Brad, is really the first person to put together the taxonomy. I do want to give a quick shout out to the Research Ops Slack community. If you're looking for a place to start in terms of taxonomy, they recently did sessions, maybe a couple months ago, about minimum viable taxonomies, basically chatting with research ops professionals. They did some optimal workshop studies. They did some interviews. and basically set up what they consider to be a minimum viable taxonomy. So if you're looking for a place to start, those are free resources from that community. And it's really fantastic. But I think my Brad's experience, having spent a couple years in the field, just kind of setting up the taxonomy from there. When I joined, we talked through making some tweaks and some changes based off of language, and just trying to get folks to understand, again, the taxonomy and making sure people know what we mean when we say product or feature team, or what we mean when we say feature, and having, even just those little bubbles next to the term on the taxonomy so people can look and say, oh, okay, that's what they mean whenever they say product or feature team. But yeah, I think in terms of the Insights repository, I'm definitely the evangelical of it and trying to make sure that people are using it. And when people are curious about research, and if a particular study's been done in the past, encouraging people to go look. It's easy, I think, again, kind of talking with what Asim said earlier, there is that mental model barrier with something that we've built ourselves of like, I don't know, this is kind of confusing and I don't want to bother this person to figure out how to do it. And it's just kind of, you have to go and add that activation energy to get people in there sometimes, whether that's building a guide for how to use it or whatever. But yeah, it's one of those things that I try to champion as much as I can.
And was there anything that you did in terms of like training when you first rolled this out? How did you kind of think about the kickoff and letting the rest of the organization know?
Yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, not a ton. It's something I think about now and wish we might have done. Something that we did recently start, again, another initiative from my lead, Rodrigo, is having onboarding for research specific, where it does talk about the Insights repository in the onboarding, and everybody who joins the product union has to take this onboarding. So that's one simple way, right? Just forcing it into you're new to Auth0, great. Here's some things you need to know. Because again, the research team, it happens at a lot of companies. You kind of forget that they exist, right? Because we can be siloed at times. We've also, I talked about guides. I did write a guide for how to use our repository. Again, can't be sure how many people have actually looked at it. I've shared it out a bunch. Fingers crossed that people have used it and been able to go through the repository themselves. But even just the willingness for somebody to be like, hey, I don't necessarily know how to use this. Can you walk me through it? Or can you help me find what I'm looking for? Like, I'm happy to run a query for somebody and just send them all the research that's available, and let that be that. Because at the end of the day, that's my job, right? I work in ops. I'm here to help facilitate people complete the research they want to do. And, something you brought up earlier, if we don't want people repeating studies, like I would rather spend half my day looking for studies for people than somebody spending a month of their time on research that's already been completed. So that's a little bit about how we do that.
Makes sense. I think there's a few really good nuggets there. I mean, first off, training, clearly when you're kicking it off, it's probably good to think about it. But to your point, Carolyn, like new people are always going to be joining, right? You can do a training one time, but that doesn't necessarily mean everybody is going to know what's going on. I love that notion of putting it into the onboarding packet for some new hires, but really from my perspective, almost everybody who's joining the organization. I mean, going to the Insights repository would be useful for almost anybody, no matter what job you're in at the organization, to learn what are your customers saying about you, what are people, what are the insights that we're gathering. That's what Insights is all about, right? It's like these things are meant to be valuable for the organization. It's a perfect training ground for almost anybody that's coming in. So definitely think about that. How do you put the Insights repository into the onboarding guide for the organization? And then the other thing Carolyn mentioned was ongoing evangelism. It is an ongoing thing, right? You always have to be kind of pointing people in the right direction. And you talked about this a little bit earlier. It's like, also, how do you operationalize it into the actual bigger business process? So before a feature goes into development, making sure there's a link to the Insights repository. Before an ad goes out, make sure there's a link to the Insights repository. So think about some of those ways to really evangelize, get this out there. An Insights repository is not really valuable unless people are using it. So you have to think through this step. And then Carolyn, tell us a little bit about that kind of first import. Like, how did you go about that? Was it a big deal? Did you kind of say, oh, we'll just start new? How did you think about the historical data that had to come into the repository once you built it?
Yeah, sure. So we kind of got lucky on this point. Again, one of the things that was convenient was by the time that we had a repository, research was also pretty much brand new at Auth0. So let's see, Brad joined in January of 2020, and Sheely was our researcher at the time. And I think it was really like an early adoption in terms of the repository. So there wasn't, thankfully, a ton of historical data that needed to go into the repository. There wasn't lots of studies that needed to go in. I will say one of the things that we're trying to do now in terms of not necessarily historical data, but holistic data is trying to combine all these people at our company who have insights that may not necessarily be directly, primary research based, but we have our competitive intelligence. We have I'm trying to think, market research, and we have feedback from different customers. We have all these different channels that all this information is coming from. And right now, another big focus is how can we get all this information into one space so that you don't have to go to each different team and say, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for this. People can just go into the repository and say, okay, where is a good region for us to release this beta of our public cloud, and be able to go into that market research and say, oh, okay, here it is. This is what we have. So consolidating all that information for us right now, and even though, again, not necessarily directly related to historical data, but when you think about it, those teams have been much more active at Auth0 for longer than the research team has. So that for us kind of relates back to that a little bit.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I think the key is there's got to be something there when you actually roll out an Insights repository, right? So day one, if you're going to roll out something that's empty, then people aren't going to find the value, and you've kind of ruined that first impression. So think about this, right? Is that when you're creating an Insights repository, in most cases, there should already be some insights that are ready to be imported, ready to be uploaded there. So think about what that looks like. What are the formats of your existing studies? Is it PDFs? Do you already have nuggets pulled out? Do you already have a taxonomy ready to apply to it? And there's cool, things that you can do, like with Insights Hub, we've got an integration with Google Drive, so you can kind of pull in folders automatically and give you a head start. But definitely think through this piece. How do you make sure that you don't start day one without anything juicy for people to really, sink their teeth into when they come into the Insights Hub or the repository? And then lastly, and I'll kind of skip over this one quickly so we leave ourselves enough time for questions. I know we've only got about 7 minutes left. So Mark, I know we've got a few questions out there. Maybe you can start consolidating those just as we talk quickly through the workflows piece. But we have covered a lot of this. So I won't dive too much into it. But realistically, you've got to have this connected to some workflows. Carolyn was mentioning, connected to the Jira workflow, some of those business processes. But even when somebody's coming to you and asking for research, there should really be a workflow there. You should know, what do you need before you can kick off a project? What are the assets that you need? Do you know what market it's meant to be there for? Again, you want your Insights Hub system to do some of that work for you. Carolyn's been doing that with a lot of connection points into the other applications. Insights Hub kind of provides you with an intake form that you can customize, different project statuses that you can customize. But make sure you're thinking through the workflow so that it really becomes part of the business process. Carolyn, would you say that's accurate? Anything else to add before we kind of jump over to questions?
No, I think you crushed it. That pretty much is our process.
Amazing. All right, well, with that, let's go ahead and jump into our Q&A session. I know we've got about 5 minutes left. Mark, do you want to kick us off with some of the questions that we've seen come over?
Absolutely. So there's a bunch of stuff, but great presentation. Just a heads up, though, if you didn't get to your question, make sure that reach out to either Caroline, Ashim, or Nick, and we'll get back to you. But let's very quickly get into some questions. I'm going to put some up on the screen. Feel free to take it whoever thinks that they want to. Here, let me just put this up here. So this says this democratizing is equal to publishing and distributing observations of collected data to get feedback from the demos or distributors to interpret on. So how does it work for service lines versus product lines? Do we have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Carolyn. Why don't you take it first?
No worries. Sorry about that. Love a good digital session. For us, democratization is basically about making sure anybody who wants to do research can do research, right? So a lot of the issues we see with evangelism is like, okay, if you've got only, maybe you work at a really great company and you've got a pretty heavily staffed research team, right? Maybe you have 8 researchers. It's really hard sometimes to get people to believe in the research because they're not necessarily there in the room watching it happen. One of the great things about having a democratized practice is that you're having the people who are going out and making the product be a part of that research. So there's less of a, I don't know if I believe that, or I don't know if I agree with that, with having people actually there in the room. And even beyond just the people I mentioned earlier, product managers, product designers, product marketers, et cetera. We have observers who are engineers, who are leadership positions, being able to come and see and listen to what actual customers, or even folks who aren't necessarily customers, have to say is really important for us. And that's why, and what we mean whenever we say democratization.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And the only thing I would add there is it's also in the sense democratize about actually getting access to the research. I think so often insights teams, they do the research for one team in their organization. They send the report to that team. Nobody else gets to see it. And there's so many other teams that can get value from that. And so that's really, I think, a core philosophy with any insights repository is give other people access. Maybe there's some roles and permissions, but realistically, you're doing research for the company, probably most people should be able to get access, see it, and learn from it. So I think that's really another core piece to this notion of democratization.
That's actually a good point. In fact, that leads us into another of our questions that actually came from someone who submitted this ahead of time was, how do you approach the level of insights or details so they are beneficial for various users of the repository? So as in, is there a way you're breaking this down into users who need higher level insights and those who need more informative or less rolled up and summary level insights? How do you define that? So different stakeholders getting different insights.
I can take this one. Again, I think the really important thing there is context, right? So depending upon how you approach this, just thinking again, kind of with the new initiatives we're doing for making sure insights don't go stale. What I may share with our business agility team who runs our quarterly planning may be different than what I share in our Jira product discovery board for our feature team submitting ideas. When it comes to our actual insights repository, the way that we have it set up is that high level kind of, here are the 5 key takeaways from this study with the attached research summary. So if you find yourself being intrigued from, the quick couple of nuggets that you see, you can go out and get the more detailed information should you so want to. But, if you're looking for something specific and you look at the individual nuggets and you're like, this isn't really what I was hoping for in terms of, helping me make this decision, you don't have to go any further than that. So it's hopefully a way that people can, efficiently use our insights. But again, I think for the key would be context in that scenario.
Makes sense. All right, I think we'll leave time for one more question. And like I said before, if we didn't get to your question, we'll make sure that we get back to you, or you can definitely reach out to all of us. But Kenji asked, and I think this is a great question because this shows a very high-level overview, as how can I apply Insights repositories to brand management strategies? I think this is a very interesting one.
Carolyn, any thoughts on that one?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think for us, it's kind of interesting. We're in the process of this right now. I'm thinking about insights specifically within our panel management, right? So we're in the midst of a big recruiting push to increase the size of our research panel. And one of the things we're looking to do with our insights is specifically, we're launching a microsite. We're going to be launching a blog post, basically marketing this research panel. And one of the things we'll be doing in that sense is being able to say, like, look, this is previous research that's been done. Here's how this customer's opinion or these customers' opinions have shaped our product, and basically giving people the understanding of like, oh, I really can come and make a difference and share my opinion of this product. And not only that, but also be compensated for my time. Like, yeah, this is definitely something I want to do. In terms of a larger brand marketing campaign, I don't know. I think that would be really interesting to take a look at. But for us, that's one way we're using our insights for marketing purposes.
Nice.
Yeah, I can just talk on that a little bit before we close off. And we've seen a lot of our customers doing, kind of brand tracking studies. The key about a brand tracking study, you got to do it over time, right? You want to compare it to what happened last month or the quarter before. And so being able to give people those reports in a one place where they can go back as far as they need to. So if they're kind of comparing brand recognition in one market today versus same quarter last year, it's really easy for them to find that information instead of asking your research team to go out and run another brand tracking study. With brand segmentation and the different brand portfolios become really important. So if you're a very large company with lots of different products, lots of different brands, you want to be able to have that in your taxonomy. So people can go and they can look at what's the research that you've done or particular regions and make that available to them. You also want to think about it with regards to how you're actually promoting the brand. So before an ad campaign goes out, is there a piece of research that's already in the repository that says, yeah, this is a good idea. These ad concepts have already been tested. We've tested the taglines, the copy. We've tested which markets these are going to work well in. And so almost everything in brand marketing should come back to some research. And that research should be made available in the Insights Repository, so brand managers don't always have to ask for it. It's already there, and they can use it in all of the day-to-day work that they're doing.
Absolutely. I think it's great that you can use a Insights Repository platform for high-frequency research and even longitudinal tracking, right? So while we can go on and on about this, we're at the hour. So thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us today. And Ashim, thank you so much for stepping in for Nick at the last minute. I hope all of you users, you've had a great session. We'd love to hear from you. Just let us know your feedback. Keep an eye out for the recording and the deck and the best practices tool. But with that, we'll leave you for today. Thank you so much and have a good one.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great one. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.